Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. Today we begin a new module which is management of threatened species. Now conservation is a field in which we utilize all our learnings from ecology for the benefit of organisms and for the benefit of habitat. So we will be using all different learnings that we have had so far in ecology to understand why some species are facing this threat of extinction and what can be done for those particular species. Now this particular module will have 3 lectures. The first is threats to species. Why are there some species that are under threat? The second would be in situ conservation, which is conservation on site, and third will be ex situ conservation, which is conservation away from the natural or the existing habitats of the organisms. So let us begin with the first lecture, which is threats to species. Now if we ask this question, why are some organisms facing a threat? So we can discern an answer from ecology. The factors that are responsible for threats to organisms are the opposite question to why things are found where they are found. So in one of our earlier lectures we had looked at why are organisms found in certain locations and not in other locations. Now organisms are found in certain locations because they have situations that are useful or that are helpful for the survival of those particular organisms in those particular areas. So for instance, if there is an organism that requires a low temperature, maybe requires some specific kind of foods, maybe requires some specific kinds of shelters, and if we have those conditions available in certain portions of the earth, so that organism will be found in those particular locations. Now a threat to that organism would be if we remove all of these suitable conditions. So if we remove that particular source of food, if we remove that particular source of shelter, or maybe remove that particular lifestyle of the organism, maybe encroach upon those habitats, so that would result in a threat. So this is the opposite question to why things are found where they are found. So if we have a push factor everywhere and a pull factor nowhere, so that would mean that this organism is getting a stress from all different sides to vacate this particular portion of habitat, but it does not have any other place to go. So that would form a major threat to that particular species. So push factors everywhere and pull factors nowhere. So what could be these push factors? These push factors could be no suitable habitat for the organism. Either it is too hot or too cold, or there are no trees, no food, no nutrients for this organism to survive on, or if it lives in a forest and this forest is completely burnt out, or if this area becomes polluted. So if there is an organism that lives in a lake and you use that particular lake as a dumping site, so you are adding a number of pollutants into that area, so that it is now not able to live in that particular lake, or or its habitats are now no more suited behaviorally, in which case we will have a look at habitat selection. Now habitat selection is a behavioral process in which an organism selects a particular habitat. So for instance, you can have mosquitoes in paddy fields, but then different kinds of mosquitoes, different species of mosquitoes will utilize different kinds of paddy fields to lay their eggs. So that is a behavioral selection. So if you remove any particular habitat that is being selected by an organism behaviorally, so which is in terms of the organism that is the best suited habitat, if you remove that habitat, so behaviorally it will not find itself comfortable in the other habitats. The other push factor could be a lot of competition. So if you have a number of invasive species in a forest, so if you have a forest in which you have invasive species like lantana, so lantana is now growing very fast in a number of forests, and it covers a major portion of the ground that is there in those forests. So if you have lantana that is covering up all the land, so other herbs and shrubs would be competed out. So that is a push factor. Too many predators or diseases in any area is another push factor. Or if an organism is actively being hunted, it is actively being killed out, it is actively being poached, so that is another push factor. or small population dynamics. They also act as push factors or threat factors, such as things like LE effect. Now, LE effect is an effect in which if you have an organism that lives in large size packs. So, if you have a pack living organism, if you reduce the size of the packs, so the efficiency of this organism to get food, to get mate, to protect itself gets reduced. Or in certain situations when the density of organisms is very less, so the organisms are not able to find their mates. So, in those situations we are seeing LE effect in picture. Or you could have small population dynamics such as stochastic deaths. So, just by chance you have a large number of deaths. So, these are all different threat factors. So, you have push factors that are resulting into threats, and there are some factors that are coming out because of chance events. Now, these factors can be divided into two parts. One are those factors that push a population towards smaller numbers through population dynamics. So, we had a look at population ecology. We know how populations survive, how populations increase in their sizes, and if you have a scenario in which there is something that is threatening the growth of the population, there is something that is increasing the death rate, there is something that is reducing the birth rate. So, all these kinds of factors that will play a role when your population is large in size and are trying to reduce the population size through population dynamics are called as declining population paradigm. And the other factors, there are a number of other factors that push a small population towards extinction, and they are studied in the small population paradigm. So, essentially what we are saying here is, if you consider any species that is under a threat of extinction, so you will have a large population. Now, this large population in time, because of certain threats, becomes a small population. And then when it is already a very small population, there could be some other threats that would lead to its extinction. Now, when we are considering this portion, how does a large population become a small population? So, in that case we are talking about the declining population paradigm. So, we are asking the question, what are those threats that are causing this large population to turn into a smaller population? And when we consider this portion, how does a small population become extinct? So, here we are talking about the small population paradigm. Now, we looked at a number of threat factors. Now, if we ask this question, what are those factors that are causing a population to decline to smaller populations, and what are those factors that are pushing a small population towards extinction? So, we will be talking about the declining population paradigm and the small population paradigm. So, let us look at the declining population paradigm. What kinds of threat factors would result in a smallness of a population? So, if you are eating up the habitat of any particular organism, if you are causing the habitat to shrink, or if you are pushing this organism away from its own habitat so that it does not have enough amount of habitats left for itself, or if you are putting it in some kind of competitive pressure. So, for instance, in a grassland that is being used by cheetahs and sambars, you are taking your cows and buffaloes for grazing. So, in that case the cheetahs and sambars are now not able to compete with the cows and buffaloes. So, in that case they are being pushed out. So, factors such as these, non-availability of a suitable habitat or reduced availability of a suitable habitat, or being competed out or being killed out through poaching, all of these would be studied under the declining population paradigm. And the other kinds of factors that play a role in the small population dynamics, LE effects, stochastic deaths and so on, will be studied under the small population paradigm. So, we can say in other words that there are two kinds of factors that are playing a role at all times. Some of these are deterministic factors which are acting at large population sizes, and some of these are stochastic factors or chance factors. Now, deterministic factors are those that play a determined role in the population dynamics, and stochastic factors are those factors that play a chance role in the population dynamics. Now, chance factors become more important when you have smaller sized populations. Why? Because if suppose you have a population in which you have 10,000 young ones that are born. Now, on an average we can say that 50% of them will be males, 50% of them will be females. So, roughly 5,000 male offsprings and 5,000 female offsprings. Now, it is possible by chance that in place of 5,000 you get say 4,990 male offsprings and 5,010 female offsprings, but that would be roughly the amount of chance variation that you will see in a large population. Whereas, if you consider a very small population, so suppose you have only 4 offsprings that are born. So, in those situations roughly you should be having, so you have 4 offsprings. So, in that case we expect 2 of them to be males and 2 of them to be females, but then by chance it is possible that you only have 1 male and 3 females, or maybe even 0 males and 4 females, or you could have a reverse situation, you could have 3 and 1, or you could have 4 and 0. But then if you have a very small population, so the probability that you can have one of these situations increases, and the probability that you do not have any organism of a particular sex also increases very much. So, stochastic factors or chance factors play a much more important role when your population sizes are small as compared to when your population sizes are larger. Now, what are the deterministic factors and what are the stochastic factors? Now, deterministic factors could be things like birth rate, death rate and population structure. So, if you have a population with a reducing birth rate, so that would be a deterministic factor. It will not lead to an extinction in the near future, but then we can say that if the birth rate is going down, then there is some issue and this population might be vulnerable to extinction. Or if there is an increase in the death rate, suppose there are some diseases that have come into the population and so they are increasing the rates of deaths in this population. So, in this case as well we will say that there is a chance that this population is being pushed towards extinction. It is being pushed from becoming a large size population to becoming a smaller sized population. Or things such as population structure, if more and more organisms in the population are becoming old. So, in that case you have a population structure in which you have less number of young ones, less number of adults and many more number of old organisms. So, all these 3 factors, the birth rates, the death rates and the population structure play the role of deterministic factors and may push your population from being a large sized population to being a smaller sized population. Next, we have the stochastic factors or chance factors, which are more important when your population sizes are smaller. So, here you have demographic stochasticity. So, things like all the offsprings in your litter belong to the same sex, all of them are males or all of them are females. Now, that is very much unlikely when you have a large size population, but in a smaller size population, suppose you only have 2 offsprings. So, in the population, so only 2 offsprings, there is a very high chance that both of them are males or both of them are females. Or say things like deaths in the litters. So, every population would be having some amount of infant mortality and some amount of juvenile mortality. So, there is a chance that you had only 2 offsprings in the current generation and both of them died. Now, it is much less likely if you have say 2000 offsprings in a population, it is very less likely that all 2000 of them would die. But then if you have only 2 offsprings, it is a very much possible that both of them die out. So, these are demographic stochasticity. Demo is again population. So, you have demography is we are talking about the characteristics of population, and these are chance factors that act on the population characteristics. The second chance factors are environmental variations and fluctuations. Suppose you have a drought, suppose you have a flood, so that would also play a a very crucial role if you already have a very small population, or catastrophes such as forest fires and diseases, or say genetic processes such as loss of heterogeneity and inbreeding depression. So, in this case what we are saying is that if you have a large size population, so you have a number of males and a number of females, and when they are breeding randomly, so in that case there is a very small chance that brothers and sisters would mate with each other. But then if you have a very small population, suppose you only have 3 individuals left, so if you have any amount of mating, then there is a very high chance that you will push this population towards inbreeding depression in no time. Other kinds of stochastic factors are deterministic processes such as density dependent mortality on exceeding the carrying capacity of the habitat. So, in this case what we are saying is that suppose you have a habitat and this habitat can support 100 organisms. Now, in this case suppose your population size is close to around 90. So, when you are reaching close to 100, so in that case the mortality increases because your population is now reaching towards the carrying capacity. So, we had seen this in the case of the sigmoidal curve. So, when we have the sigmoidal curve, this is the carrying capacity, this is the number of organisms, and this is your time. Now, when your population has reached to this level, so it is very close to the carrying capacity. So, the in this case the death rate would increase, or probably the birth rate would also go down because of some behavioral reasons. Now, if you can support only 90 of organisms, and suppose you have 2 different kinds of organisms. So, here you have cheetal and here you have sambars in this population. Now, suppose you have both of these as 50-50. So, you have 50 cheetals and 50 sambars. So, in both of these populations you will find some amount of mortality that is going on. But then suppose stochastically, if you have a situation in which you have only say 3 cheetals left and you have 97 sambars that are left. So, in this case it is possible that because of this density dependent mortality, these 3 cheetals by chance die out, and in that case also you will be pushing a very small population of cheetals towards a complete extinction. Next, you have migration among populations. So, in this case you have 2 populations, population A and population B. So, in suppose you have these 2 populations as say Kanha and Pench. Now, suppose, and both of these are connected. So, you have Kanha tiger reserve, you have the Pench tiger reserve, and they are connected through some amounts of forest. Now, if there is some particular species that only has say 4 organisms left in Kanha, if these 4 organisms move out to Pench, then we will say that Kanha has suffered a local extinction of this particular species. So, even things such as migration among population might be responsible for a local extinction somewhere. Now, the factors that are leading species towards extinction can be remembered using this acronym HIPPO. So, HIPPO is short for hippopotamus, but then you can use it to remember. H is habitat loss. So, here you also have things like habitat degradation or habitat fragmentation, but we classify all of these as habitat loss. So, we will look at these in greater detail in a short while. I stands for invasive species. So, invasive species, if they come into your forest, they will outcompete all the other existing natural species and they will push them towards extinction. P stands for pollution. So, pollution also leads to habitat degradation. The second P stands for human overpopulation, because the more number of humans that you have on this planet, the more would be their requirements, and to meet their requirements they would be using up the resources that are available in the habitats of different organisms. So, human overpopulation also plays a very big role in the extinction process. And O refers to over harvesting. Now, over harvesting is a process in which, suppose you have a particular lake, and in this particular lake you have certain fishes, and because these fishes are also reproducing, so their population would increase with time, and so we can remove certain amount of of fishes from this particular lake to be used as food for humans. Now, suppose you have 1000 fishes here. Now, out of these 1000 fishes, if we remove say 100 fishes, so you will be left with 900 fishes in the lake, and these 900 fishes would be able to reproduce in a manner that they are able to restock the population. But then in place of taking out 100 fishes, suppose we are taking out 990 fishes. Now, in that case what happens is that we are only left with 10 fishes in this particular pond or in this particular lake. Now, 10 fishes are not sufficient to restock the whole population of the lake. So, in place of exploiting 100, if we exploit 990, that is a case of over harvesting. So, over harvesting can also push a species towards extinction, and very good examples of over harvesting are not only fishing in the lakes, but also killing of whales from the oceans, or maybe even poaching of certain animals for their skin or for their fur and so on. Now, different species will have different levels of impacts when we are having these factors of hippo. So, the most important factor is the impact of human beings. So, if you have more a larger size human population, if you have more amounts of impacts of humans on a certain habitat, it would lead to a differential impact on different species. So, sensitivity of a species to human impacts would be dependent upon these factors. The first is adaptability and resilience of the species. Now, if you have a species that is R selected, so here we are talking about R selected and K selected. Now, R selected species are those that have a very birth rate, then they reach sexual maturity faster, and in a number of circumstances there is little parental care. So, examples include things such as rats or mice or rabbits. Now, in the case of mice, so you will have a male and a female that would give rise to say 20 offsprings, and then they would become sexually mature in say around 6 to 8 months, and then each of them would also give rise to 20 other offsprings. Now, what happens in that case is that you have a very high amount of R naught or the intrinsic growth rate. So, you have a growth rate that goes like this. So, this is the number of individuals and this is time. Now, in the case of R selected species, because you have a very high R naught, so the population increases very fast, and when that happens, even if you are removing a number of organisms from that particular species, the number of organisms that are left out would be resilient enough to restock this species. So, for instance, earlier suppose you had 1000 mice in a farm and you were able to kill 900 out of them. So, 900 got killed and you are only left with 100. These 100, because they have a very high birth rate, because they reach sexual maturity very fast, because they have little parental care, so they are mostly independent right from birth. So, they will be able to restock this farmland and increase their population to come back to 1000. On the other hand, if we talk about the K selected species, now K selected species are those that have the opposite characteristics of the R selected species. So, they have a very less amount of birth rate, they reach sexual maturity in a very long period of time, and there is a lot of parental care that is required. A good example is say humans or organisms like tigers. Now, in the case of tigers, one litter, or that is one male and a female, would produce a litter of say 2, 3 or 4 cubs. Now, those 2, 3 or 4 cubs will take close to around 5 or 6 years to reach their sexual maturity, and for close to around 3 to 4 years these cubs will be under the guidance and training of their mothers, who will teach them how to hunt. Now, in these species you have a very low amount of R naught there, because there you have a very less amount of intrinsic growth rate. And so, if you kill off these species, if you go into a forest and if you hunt down tigers, so the remaining tigers will take a very long time to restock the population. So, in that case we will say that the resilience of this particular species, say tigers, towards the impacts of humans or towards poaching is less. On the other hand, the resilience of organisms such as mice or rats or rabbits is much more. So, in that case tigers will suffer a greater brunt from the human impacts as compared to the mice. The second one is human attention. So, we are talking about which species suffer a greater amount of impact because of human activities. So, the second factor is human attention. So, charismatic species such as tigers are more sensitive because humans have high demand for their skin, bones and other parts. Because humans are placing much more attention on tigers, so they will go out and want to hunt tigers, whereas they are not putting so much attention on mice. So, they might not go out and hunt for the mice that are found in the forest areas. So, that is another factor. The third factor is ecological overlap between humans and the species. So, the greater the overlap, the greater is the impact of humans on that particular species. And fourth is the home range requirements of the species. Species that require larger home ranges are more sensitive to human impacts. And a good example is the case of elephants. Now, elephants require a large size forest. So, even if you take off this much portion of the forest, so it will place a very high amount of impact on the elephants. On the other hand, if you consider another species that is a small size that has a small home range requirement, say rabbits. Now, in the case of rabbits, you have these small populations that are in different areas. So, even if you take this part of the forest out, so even in that case the other populations will be able to survive because they have a smaller home range requirement. Now, the next question is, when we talk about threats, can we quantify this threat? How real is this threat? Or what is the rate at which we are losing the species? What is the rate of extinction? Can we put a quantifiable figure onto this? So, in this case we can make use of another ecological learning, which is that of biogeography. Now, there is this island biogeography model by MacArthur and Wilson that says that species richness of an island is given by S is equal to C into e to the power of z. Now, here we are asking the question, if you have an island, so you have say this island that has an area of A1, and suppose you have this another island that has an area of A2. What will be the number of species that are found in A1 and what will be the number of species that are found in A2? So, that has been worked out, and we say that the number of species or the species richness of an island is proportional to A to the power of z. So, that is, it is proportional to some power of A. So, now that power could be say A square, or it could be A cube, or just A, or it could be square root of A and so on, but then it is proportional to some particular function of A. Now, why do we say that? Because if you have a larger sized island, so this larger sized island will probably have more diverse habitats, because as we had seen in our biogeography lectures, in the case of a smaller island probably you have sand everywhere, but then in the case of a larger size habitat you probably have sand on the beaches, but then on the insides you might have say some hills, or maybe you could have even a small stream that is draining out into the ocean, or you could have some areas that have some grasses, or you could have some areas that have certain herbs or shrubs. So, a larger sized island is able to support more amount of more amount of habitats, which would then support more number of species. Secondly, it also supports more number of organisms because this has a larger size that supports more home range species. That is, if you have a very small island, you will not be able to have organisms such as elephants that have large home range requirements, whereas if you have a larger size island, you can even incorporate those species that have larger home range requirements. So, the number of species that will be found in any area would depend on the size of the island, and this has been computed as S is equal to C into a to the power of z, where C and z are both constants. Now, we can use this equation to compute how many species we are going will lose out if the amount of habitat that is available to these species reduces, or if we are reducing the size of our forests. Now, it has been seen by looking at a number of ecosystems that z varies between 0.15 and 0.35. Now, let us take a middle value of 0.3. So, in that case, if you have an area of A1, so you will say that the number of species or the species richness is C into A1 to the power of z, which is 0.3. Now, we let this area decrease by as much as 90%. So, what we are saying in that case is, earlier we had this much of forest, and then this much amount of the forest has been encroached up for say human activities. So, only 10% of the forest remains. So, in that case, how many species would remain in that area? So, we have A2, that is the amount remaining is just 10% or 0.1 of A1. So, in that case, S2, which is the number of species that is found in this 10% area of the forest now, will be given by C into a to the power of z. Here A is 0.1 into A1 and z is 0.3. So, it will be given as C into 0.1 A1 to the power of 0.3. Now, we can compute the ratio of these species. So, in the first instance, in the whole of the forest, we had the number of species that is given by S1, and in the second instance we have only these many species remaining, which is given by S2, and we are finding out the ratio S2 by S1. Now, the larger area is A1 and the smaller area is A2, which is 0.1 of A1. So, we already know that A2 by A1 is 0.1. Now, if that be the situation, what is S2 by S1? Now, if we plug in the values, we will find this that S2 by S1 is 0.1 to the power of 0.3, which roughly comes to 50%. So, even if you have reduced your area by as much as 90%, the number of species that remain is as high as 50%. So, even though you have removed 90% of the area, you are not losing 90% of the species, you are only losing 50% of the species. But then those would be the species that preferentially require a larger size of home range, or probably those are the species that have a very specific habitat requirement. So, they are more specialized species. Now, we can use such a theory to compute how many species are we losing out by say losing out our different habitats, such as the habitats in the tropical forests. Now, we know from satellite studies that the rate at which tropical forests are actually decreasing is around 2% per annum, 1.8% per annum. And if we even take the lowest value of z, so here we are not taking z is equal to 0.3, but we are taking z is equal to 0.15, we are taking the most conservative estimate. It would translate to a loss of 0.27% per year, and we are estimating that the number of species that we have in the tropical forest is close to around 10 million species. So, if we are losing 0.27% of 10 million, it means that we are losing as high as 27,000 species per year, which is a conservative estimate of the number of species that we are losing. And similarly, we can estimate the losses from the other ecosystems. Now, what are these species? If you ask somebody, he or she would say that yeah, we lost a few species, we have lost the Yangtze dolphin, we have lost the dodo, but then most of the people will not be able to move more than say 10 species that have been lost throughout the whole process. But then we are losing around 27,000 species per year, and most of these species are those that we do not even know that they exist. A number of herpetofauna, a number of frog species, a number of snake species, a number of lizard species, and all of them are also very important for the biodiversity of those areas. Now, which species get lost is not the same across all the species. So, the amount of susceptibility of a species to extinction is not the same across different species. The susceptibility depends on the rarity of the species, and if you have a species that is more and more rare, so there is a greater chance that it gets extinct, because if you already have a rare species, it means that it has very less number of habitats that it can make use of, or it already has a very small population size. So, the number of stochastic phenomena that can play havoc to this species are very high. Rarity is a function of the ecology and evolutionary characteristics of the species. So, why are some species rarer? Some species are rarer because of three reasons. One is habitat selection and evolutionary characteristics, such as restriction to an uncommon habitat. So, a species that is found in the desert springs will be extremely rare, because it is a very specialized, it is a very uncommon habitat. We do not have a number of deserts, we do not have a number of springs in any desert. So, the number of desert springs already is very less. So, the number of useful habitats for this species already is very less. The second one is a limited geographical range, those species that are found in a single lake. So, if you lose out this lake, you lose out all the species that are found in this particular lake. And third is low population densities, example because the larger animals require more space. So, these are three reasons why certain species are rare, and these species are much more susceptible to extinction. Now, we were talking about the habitat loss or the impacts on habitat, and the impacts on habitat can be divided into 4 different categories. We have situations of habitat degradation, fragmentation, displacement and loss. So, we will look at all 4 of these. Habitat degradation is a process by which the quality of the habitat for a given species gets diminished. So, for instance, if you are living in a city and the air in the city becomes more and more polluted, so it is an example of habitat degradation, because now the habitat or the urban habitat for you is not as good as it was before. So, the habitat is getting degraded. This degradation can be because of contamination, air water pollution, eutrophication, pesticides, accumulative toxins and so on. So, we talked about the phenomena of eutrophication earlier. So, that is an example of habitat degradation. We talked about bioaccumulation earlier. So, in the case of bioaccumulation, if you spread some pesticides on the grass, so this pesticide is also taken up by the insects, then it moves up the food chain and the amount of pesticides that is available more and more up as you go increases. So, even if you have a very small amount of pesticides that was sprayed here, the concentration in the larger birds would increase to such an extent that they would start dying off. So, even a very small amount of pesticides would be enough to degrade the habitat, especially for the large size birds. Or you could have things such as trash. Trash is also another way in which we are degrading the habitats. Ghost nets and plastics. So, ghost nets are those nets that have come out into the ocean. So, essentially there was somebody who was using these nets, and probably a small portion got torn off and it drifted away into the waters, or probably there was a storm and the whole of this net was lost into the sea. Now, if you have this net into the that is there in the seas, so it will still be catching up organisms. These organisms, once they are caught, they will die when they are in these caught up in these nets, and so these are very important factors of habitat degradation. Or things such as entanglement, or even in the case of our mountains, here we are observing a species which is Nilgiri tar, and here we are observing plastic bottles. So, we are seeing degradation of habitats everywhere. These hyenas that are near a trash site. Now, if you have these hyenas that are feeding along these trash sites, probably they will also be feeding some amounts of plastics, because if you have some food that is wrapped in a plastic, the hyena does not know that plastic is not something that is to be eaten. So, it will eat up the plastics as well, and once it eats up the plastics, that will get lodged into its intestines, and once or in the stomach, and once it gets lodged in the intestines or the stomach, the amount of nutrients that this hyena will be able to absorb from the surroundings would reduce further. So, this is another example of habitat degradation. or things such as soil erosion and forest fires. So, if you have a fire in a forest, so that would also degrade this habitat, because earlier you had a number of plant species that were available as food, as shelter for different organisms. If you have a forest fire, so all these species are lost, and so this habitat has become more and more degraded for those organisms that were dependent on those small plants. Other examples of habitat degradation are water over exploitation. So, if you have, we observed this thing in Tamil Nadu, in which case we had a tiger reserve, and right next to the tiger reserve were a number of villages. Now, these villages were using quite a lot of water for irrigation. Once that is happening, the small water bodies that we had in the forest areas were getting dried out. Now, if you have a forest area in which the amount of water is less, so the habitat is not as good for the survival of animals as it was before. So, water over exploitation or deforestation, these are also examples of habitat degradation. So, in this case, here we observe that you have a very good forest, and then this is an area that has been cleared off. So, the organisms that were dependent on the forest will not be able to utilize these areas. So, this is an example of habitat degradation that is going on, or things like desertification, overgrazing of the plant species, or cultivation practices that are leading to more amount of water being used, such as these goats. Now, if you have an overgrazing because of these goats, so they will be eating up all of these small plants that are remaining in this area, and so the soil will not be held up by these plants, it will start floating around. In a very short period of time, this whole area will convert into a complete desert. So, that is also an example of habitat degradation, or activities such as draining of water bodies, dredging of water bodies, damming of water bodies, or over exploitation of certain species, or introduction of exotic species. All of these degrade the habitat. So, in the process of degradation, the habitat is getting the quality of the habitat is becoming lower and lower for a particular species. Now, if this quality becomes low to such an extent that the organism is now no more able to use this habitat, so in that case we will say that habitat degradation has become so much that it has now resulted in the loss of the habitat. The habitat is now completely lost. So, that is an extreme level of degradation. Another factor that plays a role is habitat fragmentation. Now, fragmentation occurs when a natural habitat is broken up into smaller parcels of natural ecosystems isolated from one another in a matrix of lands dominated by human activities, and it involves both loss and isolation of habitats. So, in the case of habitat fragmentation, we had earlier a large sized habitat, and now we are dividing this habitat into smaller portions. So, for instance, if we have a number of roads, now earlier in the whole forest, when you did not have these roads, and if you had a snake say at this location, and this snake wanted to reach this location, it would very easily be able to reach. But now if you have so many roads in this area, this snake would have to come onto a road to cross this area, and once it comes on top of this road, it is possible that it gets overrun by some vehicle and it dies. So, fragmentation is also a very important phenomena that is leading to extinction or deaths of species. Now, we have seen before that larger sized forests or larger sized habitats support more number of species. Why? Because one, they have more number of habitats. Consider the case of larger sized islands where we have hills, we have rivers, we have streams, we have grasslands, we have shrubs, which are not there in a smaller size island. Second, a larger fragment is more likely to have both common and uncommon species, whereas smaller fragments are more likely to have only the common species. And third, smaller fragments have smaller populations, so the chances of getting extinct are also large. So, what we see in this, what we are saying in this case is that if you have a large sized forest, and this forest supports say around 10,000 organisms of a particular species. Now, in the process of fragmentation, you have divided this forest into very small parcels of land, and say this particular parcel is able to support say 10 individuals of this species. Now, in the case in the earlier case where we had 10,000 individuals, we only had deterministic factors that were playing a role in the population dynamics. But when we have only 10 individuals, we will also have the role of stochastic factors. So, the chances that this particular patch becomes extinct, so there is a local extinction in this particular patch, is very high. Similarly, it is very high in this patch, it is very high in this patch. So, just by dividing the whole forest into smaller patches, we have ensured that the extinction probability in all of these smaller patches is very high, and in that case it is very likely that we will have local extinctions in all of these patches and the species will die out completely. So, this is also another way in which it is bad to have the smaller patches. Now, how do we fragment a habitat, or what are the factors that are leading to fragmentation of habitats? We have things like roads, railways, dams and other structures. Now, these structures lead to mortality when an animal is run over by railways or they are run over by roads, by vehicles that are plying on the roads, or they act as physical barriers. So, the animal is not able to cross to the other side because it acts as a very big barrier for the animal, or it acts as a psychological barrier. So, if you have a road that is very much teeming with traffic, so the animal will find it extremely psychologically stressful to cross that particular road, or it increases access to the anthropogenic influences. So, if you have roads and railways in an area, the more number of human beings will reach that area, and so the amount of human influences will also increase, or access to invasive species and exotic species. So, that is one way in which we are fragmenting the habitat. The second one is diversion of land for agriculture. So, suppose we have this forest and suppose we divert this particular portion for agriculture. So, if that happens, we have already divided this forest into two smaller patches. Third is linear infrastructure. So, linear infrastructure includes things such as pipelines or creation of a dam. Dam also plays a very important role in habitat fragmentation, because now organisms that are there on this side of the dam find it very difficult to reach this side, whereas earlier there was a connecting land parcel through which they were able to move. Now, that would again depend on the size of the dam, but then this is also a very big factor in habitat fragmentation. Now, habitat fragmentation, how does it actually occur when we look at the forest situations? So, suppose this is a forest. The habitat fragmentation would start by dissecting of this forest. So, in the first place, we have set up these roads. So, probably this is a national highway that is connecting a very two large towns, and then these are small roads that are constructed, so that some small hamlets that were inside are now more connected to the forest, to the main roads. So, the fragmentation begins by this process of dissection. Once dissection happens, so now humans are finding it more and more possible to access these areas. The accessibility has increased. Once you have more amount of accessibility, so people would want to come and live in those areas. So, probably now there would be a small hamlet here, probably there would be one person who sets up a house somewhere here, because now it is accessible for this person. Probably there would be some people who would start some amount of farming or some amount of dairy, or probably people would want to set up some amount of some farm here, so that the people who are plying on this particular highway have now an access to, say, milk or milk products, and these persons also see a livelihood opportunity, because they have a ready market in terms of the people who are plying on these roads. So, in a number of forest areas, you will see that there are people who are sitting on the side of the roads and they are trying to sell you something, probably vegetables, probably fruits, or milk products, and so on. So, this stage is known as perforation. Now, when perforation happens, you are increasing the impacts of the human beings, because if you have these cattle here, if you have some amount of grazing that is going on, these cattle will go into the forest areas to graze, and once that happens, they are going to compete with the wild animals. So, we see things like livestock in the forest. Once perforation has happened, the next stage would be fragmentation, because we had this small settlement here, we had a settlement here. Now, they would want to join with the main settlement. So, they would increase in their size. So the size of this hamlet is now increasing. Once that happens, this whole area becomes a settlement, this whole area becomes a settlement, and it joins with the other settlement here, because the settlement is also increasing in size. When that is happening, once all of these have joined together, so now if an animal wants to move from this side to this side, it will have to cross this particular village, then it will reach a small patch of forest, then it will have to cross this particular village, and then it will be able to reach this side. So in this case, what we are observing is fragmentation of the habitat, because in place of a large sized forest, now we have smaller sized patches that are remaining. So this is how a fragmentation would look like. So here we have forest on this side, on these hills we have the forest, and this whole area has now been taken up for plantations. So now this is fragmenting this habitat. After fragmentation, the next stage is that of attrition. Now attrition is the process in which those smaller sized patches that were remaining, they are also now being taken up for human use. So once you have all these villages, once you have so many cattle here, and there is a good market in terms of the people who are buying these products, so government would also want to set up some schools, government would also want to provide the facilities of say hospitals in this area. Probably there would be some small industries that would come up in these areas, probably there would be an access to electricity as well, and when all of this happens, it plays a positive feedback, because if you have this area that has such good environments, plus it has a ready market, plus it has so many people, plus it has electricity, so now more and more people would want to come and live in this area. So probably there would be some people who would want to buy up these lands for investment purposes. Once that happens, the whole amount of human dominated landscape would increase, and these patches would become even smaller in size with time. So that is the process of attrition, and this is a good example of attrition, in which this whole hill, which was earlier full of forest, now only has this much amount of forest left. The rest all the places have now been taken up for human use. And a good example of these processes is seen in the case of Amazon rainforest. So here we are looking at a rainforest in Brazil, and we are looking at 1975 images. Now in 1975 the whole area was forest, then there was a road that was constructed, and then the amount of influences increased, and then by 2001 the whole of the area was taken up, and then by 2009 we can see that there is hardly any natural habitat that is remaining in this particular area. So this is an example from the satellite images. So earlier, while we had this whole big sized forest that was available as a habitat for so many species, now because of the road that was set up, all of these areas have now been taken up and only very small patches are remaining. So that is the process of habitat fragmentation, and this is an example of an extremely fragmented habitat. So recently Supreme Court has acted upon this habitat. What people had done was that we had these forests, and all these areas were taken up for the settlement of for the setting up of resorts. Now Supreme Court came down harshly on these resorts, and all of these resorts were then closed down, because they were fragmenting this habitat. If you had an elephant that had to move from point 1 to this point, it could not move without passing through all these human habitations. Now besides human habitat fragmentation, the other phenomenon that is playing a big role is known as habitat displacement. Habitat displacement is shifting of wildlife to non-prime or subprime habitats, example hills or rocky patches. Now this is again something that we have seen earlier in ecology. The good example was, you have some grasslands and then you have this hill, and there are, so this area has lots of grasses, and this area probably is bouldery, so you do not have many grasses on the hill side. Now earlier you had a number of wildlife that were using these areas because they want grasses to feed upon. Now if you have human beings that come with their cattle, so you have cattle and they are also coming with dogs, once that happens the wildlife will not be able to compete with the cattle. So in that case the wildlife will have no other option than to move to these hilly areas. So once that happens, you won't have any wildlife that is left in this area. All the wildlife is now found here, and all of this area, the grasslands, have been taken up by the cattle. Now, in this process, this particular prime habitat, so this was a prime habitat because it provided a lot of grass, a lot of fodder to the animals. Now, this habitat was taken up by the cattle and the animals were shifted to this particular habitat, which is a subprime habitat, because it is all full of rocks and it does not have ample amount of fodder available for the animals. Once that happens, we call it as habitat displacement. So, it is shifting of wildlife to non-prime or subprime habitats, example hills or rocky patches. So, we can see that there are a number of processes through which the wildlife is losing their habitat. We have the process of habitat degradation, where the quality is reducing. If the quality reduces to a very high extent, we will have a habitat loss. We can also have habitat fragmentation, in which a big parcel of land is now getting converted into smaller parcels of land, or we can have situations of habitat displacement, where the wildlife is shifted to non-prime habitats or subprime habitats. And we have also seen, so all of these are processes that we can understand in the process of, in the science of ecology. Now, we also saw that different animals or different organisms will have different susceptibility because of different susceptibility to extinction, because of factors such as how specialized are those organisms. Do they require a specialized habitat or are they generalist? Or what is the process of habitat selection for these organisms? Or how close is the overlap of their habitats with humans? Now, all these susceptibility factors are also things that we study in ecology. The third set of factors is the population size or the population dynamics. Do we have deterministic factors that are acting on these populations because they are large in size, or do we have stochastic factors? Now, all of these are different subtopics or different subfields of ecology that we have seen, and we can use information from all of these to be put into the cause of conservation. So, we can say that if we wanted to conserve these species, how do we avoid habitat degradation or habitat loss or fragmentation or displacement, or how do we identify those species that are very much highly susceptible to becoming extinct, or how do we understand the population dynamics of these organisms. So, we can use all of these information to understand the threat that is being perceived by different species, and one way in which this is done is known as population viability analysis. Now, population viability is the ability of a population to persist or to avoid extinction. So, what we are asking here is, suppose we have 2500 tigers in our country, what is the probability that after 100 years we will still have tigers in our country, or what is the possibility that all of these tigers will die out, they will become extinct in our country. So, population viability analysis is an analysis of the viability of a population, or it is a process by which extinction probability of a single species population is assessed by integrating data on life history, demography and genetics of the species with information on the variability of the environment, diseases, stochasticity, etc., by utilizing mathematical models and computer simulations in order to predict whether the population will remain viable or go extinct in a decided time frame under various management options. So, this is one place where we are using different subdisciplines of ecology. We are looking at population ecology, we are looking at genetics of different species, we are looking at environmental variations or ecosystem level perturbations to understand whether a population is going to persist for a long time or not. So, that is population viability analysis, and in this lecture we looked at why certain species are under threat of extinction, what are the ways in which different species become exposed to different threats, what are stochastic factors, what are deterministic factors, and how in through the process of habitat degradation, loss, fragmentation and displacement, we are putting a stress on a number of individuals. Now, all of these are ecological learnings that we are making use of to conserve different species. So, that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.